So today I'm going to try some high-speed water balloon burst photography in order to recreate something like this picture by Tom Bullock. So there's two ways we can approach high-speed water balloon burst photography. The first way is to me the easier option because it just involves using a really fast shutter speed in bright sunlight. And we're going to do this method in this video. I'll do a part 2 video which covers the second option of using flash to freeze the explosion of the water balloon. Alright, so let's get started with water balloon burst photography using a fast shutter speed in bright sunlight. The first thing we need to do is to gather all our equipment, and here's what I've got. So I've got a tripod to keep things steady and a camera to take the pictures. Ideally, you'd want a 50mm to 100mm focal length lens so that your camera can be far enough away from the balloon water splashes. So in place of a dedicated camera, I also tried using an iPhone in burst mode. Burst mode basically means that while you hold the shutter button, the phone's going to just keep taking a bunch of pictures. So to take burst photos on your iPhone, you just tap on the shutter button and swipe left while continuing to hold the shutter button down. Alternatively, you can press the volume up button, and while you continue to hold the volume up button, the camera will just keep taking pictures. But you do need to enable this by going to Settings, Camera, and then enable the Use Volume Up for Burst. So I found that it is possible to use an iPhone for this type of water balloon burst photography, but because you can't manually set the shutter speed from the native camera app, it'll be a gamble on whether or not you'll end up with a sharp photo or a motion blurred photo. So here's some sample shots. This one seems to be relatively okay. The action is frozen, but then this one at the same time, it has some motion blur to it and doesn't capture a crisp image. So if you just have an iPhone as a camera, it's totally possible to do this type of water balloon burst photography. It just might take a little bit more of a trial and error. And next, a backdrop is recommended but optional. So I was trying to put up a backdrop, but I had to scrap that idea since it was a windy day and I didn't have any weights for my backdrop, so the backdrop stands just kept falling over. So note that if you do use a backdrop, then darker colors are preferable, such as black. So if you just have a black bedsheet, that totally works too. And for the main attraction, you're going to need balloons. So ideally, you'd want medium-sized balloons, but those take a little longer to fill up because you have to do them one by one. Whereas the smaller bunch of balloon types are easier to fill up because you can fill up multiple balloons at once and you just shake them off to tie up the balloons. So most of my testing was done with a smaller bunch of balloons, but I did try the bigger latex balloons that weren't specifically made as water balloons. And so if you use those bigger balloons, just note that those might be a little harder to pop. And next you'll need to figure out a way to suspend the water balloon. I had a clothesline hanging outside, so I just attached a fishing line with a binder clip to the clothesline. By using the binder clip, I could easily change out the water balloons. And the fishing line that I used was rated for 8 pounds. And this setup worked well for the smaller balloons, but it couldn't quite hold up to the bigger balloons. So you might just want to use regular string instead of fishing line if you're going to be using the bigger balloons. If you want to keep things looking clean, it's better to use the same color string as the color of your background. Now you're going to need something to pop the balloon with. This can be a bow and arrow, a dart, a fancy engineered Rube Goldberg machine, or just a simple sharp object like a safety pin attached to a long stick. If you want to make it fancy, you can also paint it with the same color as your background so it won't be as visible in the picture. And that brings us to step 2, which is filling the balloons. So you'll want to prepare the balloons in advance so you don't waste shooting time. You can fill the balloons up with straight water, but you can also get creative and add some food coloring or a little bit of milk to add some color to the water burst. Instead of water, you could also try filling up the balloon with talcum powder for other interesting effects. And now step 3 is to set up your equipment in the bright sunlight. So if you're using a backdrop, you want to plan your photo shoot in the midday sun when the sun is shining at a high angle. So for example, we have our sun beaming down this way. You want to set your backdrop up so that it's in the shadows and the sun beams are angled above the backdrop and pointing at the water balloon. By having the backdrop in the shadow, it'll help to separate the balloon from the background. Alright, step 4 is to configure your camera settings. So start by putting your camera into the fastest burst continuous shooting mode. So that means that while you're pressing the shutter button, the camera is going to keep rapidly taking pictures. You want to set your camera to manual mode so that you can manually set your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now set your camera to the fastest shutter speed it can go. So for my Sony a7 III, that was 1/8000th of a second. So if you're familiar with photography, you would think that you'd want to go with the widest aperture, that's the smallest f number, since you need to let in as much light as possible with such fast shutter speeds. However, you actually want to stop down the aperture to about f5.6 or more to ensure that you don't have too narrow of a depth of field. If the aperture is too wide open, like at f2, then you might end up with out of focus water droplets. So set the ISO to where you can achieve a good exposure based on your shutter speed and aperture settings. If the image is too dark, then you'll increase the ISO, but increasing the ISO too much can cause noise and grain in the resulting photo. So that's why I said you have to kind of play around with the ISO and aperture settings to find a nice balance. And then you'll want to autofocus on the balloon and then switch to manual focus. That way your focus is not going to get lost when you're actually taking the pictures. So it's much easier to have an assistant pop the balloon for you. Now I'm on a low budget, so I needed to use cheap child labor, my 4-year-old son. But with low prices also comes low quality, because my assistant soon got scared of popping balloons and then I had to pop them myself. So I did put my safety pin poker on a very long selfie stick so that I could control the camera while popping the balloons myself. So I pushed down the shutter to put it into burst photography, and the camera is just continuously taking pictures, and then I would pop the balloon. So all in all, it was a fun shoot to try. If I weren't so stingy and lazy, I would have done more of the balloons filled with colored water, since those were my favorite. Unfortunately, I don't like wasting food coloring or cleaning up the colored mess, so I only did a few of those. Now if you like this video, then please subscribe and check out part 2, where I try the water balloon explosion by utilizing flash. Thank you for watching.